When I was lying on the cold hospital bed, the white sheets felt rough against my skin, as if every corner of this clean, sterile world was trying to remind me of my helplessness. The air in the room was heavy and unfriendly, except for one sound, the monotonous, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, counting each of my breaths. It felt strange, as if I were part of a machine, and every movement of mine was being recorded, calculated, and then followed through, like an ordinary part of this cold machine. I was tired, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The feeling of fatigue weighed down on me, as if invisible chains were holding me captive. My entire body ached, but not as much as my inner world. The pain in my stomach seemed insignificant compared to what was happening inside me. I had long since lost track of the days since I had been here. It felt like an old routine, hospital, waiting, emptiness. And here I was, in this silence. It pressed down on me. Dr. Wilson had come to see me the day before. His gaze was focused, and his words were direct and confident. He explained that I had an ulcer, and that the cause of it was my lifestyle, my habit of keeping everything inside, accumulating over the years. Suppressing my emotions, that's what had led to this. By not allowing myself to speak, by not expressing what tormented me, I had brought this illness upon my body. Suppressing these emotions is harmful to your health, he said, adjusting his glasses, as usual, with a light motion that always seemed a little theatrical to me. I nodded, and at that moment, it seemed as though I accepted his words too calmly. Perhaps there was no space in my mind for truly understanding them. I simply responded as I was accustomed to, not allowing my feelings to surface. I thought about it, doctor. What else could I say? Yes, I understood that emotions are harmful. But what could I do with them? How was I supposed to deal with all that had accumulated inside? After Dr. Wilson left, David entered the room. My husband. We had been together for 15 years. It had been a long journey we had once started with hope and ambition, with youthful excitement. He was always tall, with chestnut hair, which, over the years, had started to gray at the temples. That grayness, as I saw it, was one of the most obvious signs of time passing. He looked impeccable, as always, in a perfectly tailored suit, which, despite its flawless appearance, somehow didn't fit the atmosphere of this place. But something had changed. I noticed it immediately, as soon as his face, once so calm and confident, now reflected signs of stress. His eyes were tense, and his movements sharp. He was out of his element here, in the hospital, surrounded by these white walls and painful sounds. He felt like an outsider. Odd, because I was the one imprisoned here, not him. He opened his mouth to say something, but before speaking, he began clearing his throat. An alarm signal. I knew it was something important. He always did that before discussing something serious, when words started to slide heavily down his throat. He didn't continue immediately. A pause hung between us, and that silence suddenly became meaningful. I felt how each moment stretched, how each of his movements, each glance, seemed to carry some new, unexpected weight. Jane, he finally said, his voice sounding as though he were holding back something important that was about to burst out. But then he suddenly fell silent. I shifted my gaze from his face to the empty wall, trying to catch some hint, but I couldn't. The feeling of emptiness only grew stronger. I want a divorce, he said. These words hung in the air. I felt as though they had struck me in the chest, not like lightning, but like a heavy, dull fall. I looked at him, but I couldn't understand what was happening. The words sounded distant, as if they were spoken by someone other than the person with whom I had spent half my life. It felt like it came from another world. I didn't know what to say. The pain didn't come right away. First, there was a kind of numbness, as if a part of me refused to acknowledge what had been said. I tried to understand what was happening, what had led to these words, but my mind refused to think. Why did it sound as though everything between us had been lost at some point? I leaned a little closer, trying to catch one last glance from David, but he was already far away, absorbed in his own thoughts. There was something estranged in the way he looked at us, the doctor and me, as though he were not part of this conversation, but an outside observer. I noticed how his face twisted with irritation, how he kept glancing back and forth between us, as if trying to understand what I was hiding. I knew that he wouldn't hear anything important, wouldn't absorb a single word from our conversation, but still, his presence weighed on the space, like a heavy cloud that wouldn't allow me to fully embrace this moment. "I'll take care of the paperwork," David said, and without waiting for a response, he abruptly left the room. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness that he had left, and relief that now I could be alone with my thoughts, in this quiet, almost sacred space. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to dissolve into the feeling of silence that surrounded me once again. It was quiet in the room, with only the faint hum of the TV in the background. Far away, in another world, the news were being broadcast, other people's lives continued, but I was in my own, detached from reality. And so, when silence reigned around me, I sank into a state of self-reflection, where images from the past floated up from deep within my memory. I remembered simpler times, when life seemed clear and straightforward, when there were no heavy questions that I now asked myself daily. The day I met David felt like it was just yesterday. We met by chance, as if the world itself had decided that the time had come for this introduction. Our mutual friends introduced us at a local coffee shop, a simple, everyday place where people talk about the mundane, drink coffee, and don't think that they might meet their destiny. We sat at a table, and the whole world around us seemed to disappear. At first, I didn't even pay attention to what he looked like. He was an ordinary man, with chestnut hair and kind eyes. But in the first few minutes, I felt how his energy attracted mine. The first days were filled with laughter and lightness. We talked a lot, exploring each other, discovering little things, shared interests, small details that form the foundation of any new acquaintance. We dreamed about the future, about what awaited us ahead. He often asked me questions that at the time seemed so natural, so simple. One day, during one of our first dates, when we were sitting by the lake, he asked, almost casually, "Jane, have you ever thought about traveling around the world?" These words, spoken with such interest and a light smile, struck me because I had never thought about it. We dreamed together about how we would one day go to Italy, how we would walk through the ancient streets of Rome, and then, something vague, something uncertain, would change in our lives, and the world would open up to us. But now, as I lay in this hospital room, surrounded by sounds and white walls, I understood that life was no longer the same. I felt the space between us had become empty. The questions that once seemed so important had now disappeared, dissolved in the pain that wouldn't release me. Suppressed emotions. Negativity. And now, David? Everything we had felt so temporary, so fragile. She looked at me with a knowing smile, and I felt her gaze, warm and calm, penetrate deep into my heart. In her eyes, there was such clarity, as though she could see my reflection, all my fears, doubts, and hidden desires that I had long learned to hide. "Sometimes length does not mean depth," she said. I remembered her words. They stayed with me, like a quiet but important reminder. Perhaps she didn't know how deeply they shook me, how they stirred something long forgotten, something blocked in my soul. David's decision to ask for a divorce might have been unexpected, shocking for him, but for me, it had long ceased to be a surprise. I had been waiting for this moment for years. I had thought about it for a long time, remained silent, and hid my feelings, deceiving myself that everything would be fine. But at that moment, lying on the hospital bed, holding the letter he had left for me before he left, I felt clarity and direction for the first time in years. Everything fell into place, and I understood that I was no longer afraid of what was happening. Listening to the quiet pulse from the monitor, I realized that now, with the hospital walls so close, I was ready to free myself from all the chains that had held me back. My grandmother had died a few months ago, leaving me $3 million. The letter from her lawyer was in my hands, and I seemed to feel its weight in my palms. But there was one catch, something I couldn't ignore. I had to go through the divorce with David before I could receive the inheritance. That was the condition. A bittersweet smile appeared on my lips as I remembered how I once viewed this as an undesirable state. The divorce was not just a formality. It was my ticket to freedom, freedom from everything, from David, from expectations, from the oppressive routine, from connections that brought no joy. The next morning, I decided that it was time to take my life into my own hands. This was a decision I had postponed for too long, but now, with everything falling into place, it was not only logical but necessary. I needed to find out why David was so eager for a divorce. Was there another woman, or maybe there was something hidden that he hadn't told me all these years? He had always been a private person, never liked to share his feelings. But something in his behavior lately suggested that there was much more behind his coldness than just tiredness from family life. I decided I needed to act quickly. I needed to figure out what lay behind this divorce, and if there was something I didn't know, it had to be revealed. My next step was obvious. I had to call Mark. He was a lawyer I had known since childhood. We grew up in the same neighborhood, shared childhood secrets and experiences. He knew me better than anyone, and I knew I could rely on him. Mark had always been the type of person who wasn't afraid to speak the truth, and I needed his help. "Hello, Mr. Graham, what do I owe the pleasure of hearing about you working in a second-hand bookstore?" he said, giving a restrained smile and sitting by my bed. His words sounded soft, but there was an authenticity in his voice that immediately captured my attention. I watched him for a few moments, trying to understand what lay behind his polite manner. "Yes, it's a small place, but it has its charm," he continued, raising his eyebrows and glancing around the room. I noticed how he nodded approvingly, perhaps even knowing that the place where I worked wasn't as prestigious as others, but it still held a unique meaning for me. "I've always had a passion for books," he said, with clear pride in his voice. "Over the years, I've collected many rare editions, and there's one particular book that I thought might interest you." My curiosity, always keen when it comes to anything related to books, instantly piqued. My soul seemed to respond to these words, and I felt my attention focus entirely on him. "It's an old rare edition of Pride and Prejudice," Mr. Graham continued. I froze. Every word felt like a quiet explosion. Pride and Prejudice, a book I had dreamed of for many years, a symbol of my aspiration for something greater than ordinary life. A book that could fill my life with meaning and bring into it the beauty I had long been searching for. "See, my late wife loved this book," he said, and I noticed how his voice became soft, almost lingering, as if he were opening the doors to his past. "She told me stories about her family, about her life, and this book became something more for us than just a piece of literature." I couldn't help but feel a nostalgic sadness in his words. It seemed that behind each sentence of his, there was a memory, a shadow of losses that couldn't be reclaimed, and yet, something valuable that he was willing to pass on. "In light of this," he continued, and I was stunned by how his voice regained a little more confidence, "I thought this might be one of those things that could interest you. It's undoubtedly one of my favorite copies." I felt my heart skip a beat. In disbelief, I struggled to keep my composure. This was the very book I had dreamed of my entire life. But there was still another question lingering in my mind. Why did he want to give it to me? "I've always wanted to own a rare edition," Mr. Graham added, his smile seeming sincere, yet with a hint of mystery. I froze, trying to understand what he meant. It all sounded so tempting, but I knew that behind each of his words lay something more than just a noble desire to share a valuable legacy with someone. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, before I could find the right words. But at that moment, he continued, and I felt the weight of his next statement slowly crashing down on me. "I'm willing to sell you this book," Mr. Graham said, and his voice became a little quieter, as if he were trying to convey the significance of this step. It's a generous offer. My heart tightened sharply. Could it really be? The rare addition of pride and prejudice I had dreamed of for so long could actually be mine? I couldn't believe my ears, but at the same time, something else stirred in my chest, anxiety, something left unsaid, something hidden. But there's one problem, he continued, and I noticed how his gaze became more alert, and his manner of speaking shifted. I've recently encountered financial difficulties. David, my husband, withdrew all the money from our joint account, and now I need to somehow resolve this. But I'm sure you should think about it. This statement shattered all illusions. Everything became clear. Mr. Graham's words took on a new meaning. Everything I knew, and everything related to my husband, was now blurring, becoming less stable in my life. It was like another confirmation that everything was not as I had imagined. But deep inside, I knew I couldn't turn away from the path that lay before me now. This requires a significant portion of your assets. Mark said these words so casually, as if they meant nothing. But I knew that for David, sitting across from us, it was like a thunderstrike. He laughed nervously, with a dull, almost desperate laugh that reflected his confusion. A laugh that didn't hide his anxiety, but only intensified his sense that the world around him was crumbling. On what grounds? His voice sounded with feigned confidence, but his eyes couldn't conceal his confusion. He leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to maintain his composure, but I saw his fingers nervously clench into fists. Mark, as though anticipating this question, didn't rush to answer. Instead, he glanced at the photos he had just spread out on the table. I noticed how Clara, his wife, was beginning to grow anxious. Her gaze darted between the photos and David, her face becoming more and more tense. I couldn't help but notice the look of something like horror in her eyes. She clearly hadn't expected any of this to come out. David, seeing the photos, initially just reddened. He tried to keep his composure, but in his eyes there was no longer that certainty that had once been there. He said, in a strangled voice, "These don't prove anything. Photos can't be evidence." But Mark was undeterred. Silently, he passed me another set of pictures, and in these images, Clara was with different men, the same men who, as I now understood, were not just random acquaintances. This was no longer a one-time event, it was a recurring pattern. I noticed how David looked at Clara, and his face reflected something I had never seen before, betrayal. He was stunned, and with it, a kind of despair appeared on his face. I could almost physically feel how he was trying to comprehend what was happening, what he should do now. He tried to find an explanation, but it was long gone. "What is this?" he asked, barely containing his anger. Clara, as if recovering from a blow, hesitated. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. "I can explain," she said, but her voice trembled, and I noticed how her face turned pale. I couldn't listen to any more of these excuses, and I intervened. "There's no need," I said calmly, but with a cold tone that left no room for doubt. "Mark has already explained your profession to me, David." David remained silent. He looked defeated. His grand plan, which he had obviously pinned such hopes on, had turned into a real nightmare. I saw how his pride and confidence began to crumble, as if his entire world had just fallen apart. I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. It all had to end. I looked at him, and my words were like a sentence. "Oh, and by the way, David, my grandmother passed away and left me a significant sum. So don't worry about dinner. All you need to do now is sort out your own affairs." I watched the expression on his face, how his eyes widened and his lips pressed into a thin line. His previous confident, almost contemptuous attitude towards money seemed to melt away, like snow under the hot sun. He couldn't help but realize that now, when he had nothing left, I possessed the kind of power that could destroy him. The look on his face was a mixture of surprise and confusion, but now, with him placed in this position, I no longer felt the slightest trace of pity. I controlled my life now, and no one, neither David or the circumstances, could take that feeling from me. In that moment, I felt my strength more sharply than ever before. All the years of silence, torment, and deceit, it all came crashing down in an instant. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, like an ant colony swarming around, but I didn't hear the noise. People around me exchanged opinions, some whispered, others rushed to conclusions, but I remained focused. My thoughts were clearer than ever. I felt each cell of my body fill with determination, and there was not the slightest doubt in my mind that things would unfold exactly as I wanted. I looked straight ahead, at the grand judge's bench, its red wood, old and significant, like the very system that was meant to help me. At that moment, I was ready to face that face, ready to face the truth that was about to deliver the verdict. I knew that this meeting would not be easy, but at the same time, it was inevitable. The courtroom doors opened, and David appeared. His hair was disheveled, his face, as usual, carelessly charming, but now marked by the wrinkles of sleepless nights. He still looked attractive, but for me, it no longer mattered. I saw through him, saw everything he had been hiding behind that mask of concern. The man who had once been everything to me now seemed completely foreign. I felt no pain or regret. Only emptiness, which was gradually being filled with a clearer, more resolute understanding. Mark, my lawyer, stood beside me, holding my hand firmly. His presence at that moment became an anchor for me. He didn't say a word, but I felt that his support was not just a professional obligation, but a genuine desire to help me regain everything that had been lost. He leaned in and whispered, "Today's the day, Jane. We'll make it right." I nodded, trying to hide the ocean of emotions raging inside me. Meanwhile, David approached me, his steps slow, hesitant. He stopped in front of me and, looking into my eyes, quietly, with the slightest hint of diminishment in his voice, he said, "Jane, can we talk for just a minute?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as if everything around me disappeared. I looked at him, and it didn't take me long to realize that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for a chance to fix things between us. No, he simply wanted to lessen the pain for himself, to find a way to avoid responsibility. It was so clear that I couldn't even feel anger. I only felt a light, almost indifferent weariness. I turned to Mark to figure out what to do next. He was ready to step in, but I signaled him, "Just a minute." I could afford to listen to him. Shrugging, Mark stepped back, but his gaze never left me. I couldn't help but notice how his face showed readiness to intervene at any moment if the situation got out of hand. David took another deep breath, his face contorting with some emotions I couldn't and didn't want to know about. "I'm so sorry, Jane." He stopped, as though searching for the right words, but I could see how they eluded him. "I realize that the pain I caused you is something I can never fix. But please, can we not do this? Can we not turn everything into a spectacle?" His words were soaked in pity, but this pity wasn't for me. It was pity for himself, for the crumbling of his world. I wasn't going to comfort him. I wasn't going to feel sorry for him. He had destroyed everything that had been between us. My thoughts were clear, and I knew there was no turning back. I looked at him without saying a word, and his words, which carried neither apology nor regret, only added weight to what had been said before. In that moment, I understood that he was no longer the person with whom I had once built my life. He had become a stranger, and even his bitter attempts to regain something from the past could not overshadow the truth I had found. A month passed since the court hearing, and the world seemed entirely different to me. The subtle hum of the city, which used to be an irritating background noise, now felt almost pleasant. I sat in a small cafe near the beach, and despite its simplicity, this place had now become a symbol of peace and calm for me. Here, I could sip a cup of coffee, listen to the gentle rustle of the waves, and watch the children playing in the sand, the families who seemed to know no worries, laughing and playing with one another. Sarah, my longtime friend, joined me at the table. Her presence always brought me a special sense of comfort. We had been close for many years, and her support in the past weeks had been more important to me than anything else. When she sat across from me and looked into my eyes, I noticed the faint hint of a smirk in her gaze, as always, in moments when she knew I was ready for an honest conversation. "What's it like to feel free?" she asked, with a teasing smile. I slowed my movements slightly, gathering my thoughts, then responded, feeling how the lightness she referred to was becoming a part of me. "It's like breathing without the weight on your chest," I answered, taking a sip from my mug. The taste of coffee was so mundane, but it was in that very ordinariness that I felt true freedom. Sarah smirked, but there was no mockery in her look, only a warm smile of understanding. "I never understood why you held on for so long," she said, nodding as if summarizing all the years of silence for which I had once blamed myself. I sighed, lowering my gaze to my cup. Those memories, those years spent with David, now seemed so distant, as though they belonged to another life. I could choose not to think about it, but deep inside, I knew it hadn't disappeared. It had simply stopped being a part of me. "I didn't understand either," I replied, "but that's in the past. Now, I'm just focused on what's ahead." Sarah watched me with a soft smile, not asking any more questions, knowing I wasn't ready to revisit the topics that had caused me so much pain. At that moment, the cafe was particularly quiet, and only the sea breeze brought with it a light coolness. I felt the inner silence I had sought for so long finally filling the space. Everything around me seemed clear and simple. Suddenly, a little boy, about 6 years old, ran up to our table. His small feet left prints in the sand, and his face held an innocent determination. He looked as though this was his world, and he was the master of it. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you help me?" His voice was soft and a bit shy, but it carried such a sincere need for assistance that I couldn't say no. "I'm building a sandcastle," he added proudly, as though it were the most important task of his life. I smiled, setting my coffee cup aside. The innocence of this boy, his confidence that everything around him was possible, touched me. In his eyes, there was no room for doubt or fear. It was so simple and so genuine. "Of course, why not?" I replied, and together we stood up to build his castle. While we sat, focused on our hands pouring sand in the right proportions, Sarah watched us with a soft look, her eyes reflecting quiet joy. She didn't say anything, but I knew that, for her, this was also something meaningful, a moment of true life when everything seemed to fall into place. I smiled at her, then returned my attention to the boy, who enthusiastically explained to me how to build towers so they wouldn't fall. Building sandcastles was a small act, but it filled me with a sense of wholeness, as if I were rebuilding my life anew, without unnecessary chains, without the past that once held me back.